Welcome to the Foul Play YouTube channel. Hey everybody, if you can believe it, it's Thursday again, and it's time for another Thirsty for Theory Thursday podcast. And today I'm really excited to have as a special guest, Dr. Silkman. How are you doing today, Dr. Silkman?
I'm doing well, Big Jeff, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, today we're going to talk about one of your favorite topics and one of your favorite people in all of NAM. What do you think about that?
Well, let me guess who that could be, Big Jeff. Someone that has a hair like a helmet. Is that a possibility? A girlfriend of mine?
So. A girlfriend of yours? I think Dr. Seuss has modeled some hairstyles after her in some of his books. I saw on Mulberry Street.
Yes. Yes. I can't wait. Yeah, so I can't wait, Big Jeff.
I was hoping that we could start today's podcast with a quick discussion of your background. One thing that's bothered me is that I know that on certain truth and guilter channels, you actually take the time to make extensive commentary.
Yes.
I know that on at least one guilter channel that they just delete your messages, and I would like people to understand your pedigree so that they can understand when they say, oh, I know he didn't know his stuff anyway. What exactly they're talking about. So if you wouldn't mind doing a brief introduction of who you are and your academic background, I think the listeners would love to hear.
Thank you, Big Jeff. Well, I attended the University of Adelaide back in 1979, believe it or not, which was a long time ago. I always had a passion for both chemistry and biology, and I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Adelaide, and I did my Bachelor of Science degree, and I majored in the biological sciences. Predominantly in biochemistry. I always had a love for all things molecular. The good thing for me when I entered the university is that the Department of Biochemistry at that time had what was known as a Centre of Excellence, and their main focus was in molecular biology, which is really studying gene manipulation, manipulating DNA, cloning DNA, sequencing DNA. So for me, as a young man going to university, it was just a fabulous time to be around the campus, especially if you like all things molecular. So my BSc was really looking into molecular biology. So Big Jeff, after I got my science degree, I felt like I knew very little. I was lucky. I applied to do an honours degree, which is a year of research, and I did that in biochemistry, the same department that had the Centre of Excellence. And my project was on gene cloning and sequencing, manipulating DNA, and I did really well in my honours research. I got a first class, which is the highest that you can get. So again, the area of my expertise was in molecular biology, DNA manipulation, etc., etc. Now,
Dr. Silkman,
yes,
that honors program that you mentioned, would that be something in the United States that we might call a master's degree or a master's program?
Yeah. The education, there are educational differences between Australia and the United States. Our normal science degree goes for 3 years, and if you want to, you can do an honours or a master's. A master's is normally a 2-year program. An honours program, Big Jeff, goes for 1 year, and it's a fairly intensive program, and it essentially involves working on a project with a supervisor in a laboratory. A master's is a bit more extended. It means that yes, you do laboratory work, but you also write up a lot of things as well. So they're fairly equivalent, Big Jeff. So once I had completed my honours degree, again, I was very thirsty for additional knowledge. And again, I was very lucky. I walked over to the Women's and Children's Hospital, which was close by to the university, and they were offering positions to become a research assistant. And the area of research was in human molecular biology. And I was quite fortunate. I got the position, and I was one of the very first people to actually be paid to do a PhD. And a PhD is a doctorate, and normally a PhD goes for about 3 or 4 years. Now, back then, we're talking about the mid-80s. This is when all the human molecular biology was starting to become developed. And my project involved isolating these molecular markers to be used in family linkage analysis, so genetic studies. So my area of expertise, I isolated DNA from blood, cloning, sequencing, gene studies, family studies. And the irony is I isolated molecular markers, polymorphic molecular markers, that ironically is what is used today for identification purposes. So things like what Cherie Cohen was doing, when she was looking at the molecular markers, the DNA genomic profiles, using these short tandem repeats. Well, I was isolating them back in the 80s. So I had a big area of expertise in all of that human molecular biology. I obtained my PhD. I did very well. I got publications from that. And Big Jeff, believe it or not, after I finished my doctorate, I walked back literally to the University of Adelaide, and I was very lucky. I got a postdoctoral research fellow where I did professional laboratory research, again in molecular biology, for 5 years. And I got some really top-notch publications there, all again in the field of DNA, gene cloning, sequencing, all of that. So I had extensive knowledge. And finally, Big Jeff, sorry, okay. Big Jeff, continue.
So not only do you have a comprehensive understanding of the theoretical underpinnings behind what goes on in this field, but you also have extensive hands-on laboratory experience of what the proper procedures are and the theoretical underpinnings of why the procedures are what they are.
Correct.
One more. You mentioned you have several publications. These publications, I assume, are in refereed journal.
Correct. When in the field of science, when you submit a paper for publication, they are refereed externally, normally by 2 independent laboratories. So they go over your paper, look at the material, make sure that you've done all the experiments correctly, that you've got proper controls, that you've drawn the correct conclusions. Look, refereed publications means that you've sufficed to very high standards. Otherwise, your paper will be rejected. So I at that stage I had 14 publications altogether. And just to finish off my education, I was very lucky. I got accepted for a role as a university lecturer, and I did that for 25 years straight. Again, in the very department I did my honours degree in biochemistry. So I was a university lecturer, tutorer, but also a practical demonstrator, where I was always in the laboratory teaching the very techniques that I'd learnt throughout my my studies. So my background is in molecular biology, and altogether over 30 years of experience. So it's very interesting, Big Jeff. when I saw the Stephen Avery case, it became pretty apparent very early on that it was all about DNA, which is an area that I have extensive knowledge about. So yeah, that's really my educational background. I'm now retired, Big Jeff. I've retired.
Fortunately for Kathleen Zellner and Stephen Avery, you are very active on the case. As a matter of fact, I'd like to point the viewers to the Foul Play YouTube channel, where they can find several expert presentations specifically on the DNA by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Silkman.
Yes. Yeah, it was, you know, a lot of that work really came about from the case itself, looking at both MAM 1 and MAM 2, and also for the listeners, it's very important that one goes back to the original documents, the testimonies, the laboratory reports. It's important to make sure that you do all the groundwork, Big Jeff. You understand the forensics of what's going on, and I really learned so much. And look, you know, I do want to give a big shout out to Rubber Ducky. A lot of these presentations were done when I was a Ducky, and you know, it was a great time, and we did a lot of very good work. The other major interest, sorry, Big Jeff, is in Brendan Dassey. I've done several presentations with another researcher as well in the Brendan Dassey case. So I've got fairly good knowledge about both cases, Big Jeff.
Well, as a good researcher does, they document their progress through publications, and
yes.
those videos, those DNA videos that you've done, have really helped educate a good number of people with regards to what's going on. So thank you very much. Okay, well, with that under our belt, Dr. Silkman, I was wondering if we could turn our attention to some of the specific information regarding this case. Focusing on the DNA. And many of us know that there's a lot of shenanigans that went on with the evidence in this case. Starting with the RAV4 and the key, and the hood-lock swab and the bullet, but not a lot of people, I think, really understand the possibility for real shenanigans if you have the cooperation of the DNA for the analyst herself.
Yes.
And I'd like to get into some of that if we could, perhaps starting with, with the standard procedures, the standard operating procedures that you find in a lab. We know that item FL was very important, and we're going to get into that.
Sure was.
But let's talk about the standard operating procedures that are normally found in a lab, and if we could, try and understand this deviation associated with that. If you could bring the listeners up to speed on that, I'd sure appreciate it.
Yeah. Look, if you've ever been in a laboratory, and I've argued this with so many guilters who just simply do not understand the point. And most guilters, I must say, none of them have ever been in a laboratory or done these sorts of experiments. Well, guys, if you are in a laboratory, you have to follow very strict rules, very strict guidelines, and you are up to a higher level of standard if you work in a forensic laboratory. Why? Because your results have the power to potentially place someone in prison or keep them from going to prison. Therefore, Big Jeff, it's very important that strict protocols are followed. Now, every laboratory has got laboratory manuals, especially forensic laboratories. And Cherie Cohane was the DNA analyst. She was the head of the DNA unit in the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory. And she, of course, appeared in the trials and was extensively questioned. Now, the reason why this is so important is that Cherie Cohane had a long past history with Stephen Avery. if you remember, he was sent to prison, I think it was in 1986, I think it was. It was for the rape case, sexual assault on Penny, that occurred in 1985. And Shariko Hain did some forensic analysis, and it turned out to be flawed hair analysis, in which Stephen Avery was charged with the sexual assault of Penny, and he went to prison for a sentence of 32 years. And it was flawed forensic evidence done by Shariko Hain. Now,
if I could ask a little bit about that very quickly.
Yes.
My understanding of that analysis is that was a visual inspection of the blonde hair that was recovered from Penny in comparison with Stephen Avery's hair sample from him. And she sort of looked at this and said that, yeah, they're the same hair. They came from the same person. What led the FBI to believe that was sort of a valid way of doing business in the first place?
I think if you look at the history of the FBI, and which I have, the FBI was in love, or J. Edgar Hoover was in love with science and the power of science for criminal convictions. And as a consequence, the FBI have extensive laboratories where they use scientific methodologies. The problem with the hair analysis, in effect, is that it's junk science. It's not definitive, right? And what is disturbing in the Steve Avery case in 1985 was the fact that I believe Stephen had between 11 and 16 eyewitnesses that placed him on the salvage yard doing work. And you could imagine he was pouring concrete at the time. And you could imagine the shock and horror of a mother and a father knowing that their son was shoulder to shoulder with them, and during a court trial they were saying, no, all the eyewitnesses are lying, they're false. This scientific proof shows that Stephen Avery was responsible for the sexual assault. And he got placed in prison for 32 years. Now remember, it also included the incident involving Stephen's cousin. But Shariko Hain did the forensics, right? So the FBI now no longer use hair analysis, nor teeth impressions, because it really is voodoo junk science. But Big Jeff, that's the way things were done. So the important point here for the listeners is that the forensic evidence trumped eyewitness testimony. Stephen got placed in prison based on Shariko Hain's incriminating evidence using the hair samples, which of course turned out to be false.
And we can't also ignore the testimony of the victim herself that the Attorney General Peg Slaughter chose to blame. How could we do anything different with the victim saying this? But that's quite a story they put together. You combine the victim with a scientific identification and your son.
Yeah, and Big Jeff, you did say something very important there, a story. And that's exactly what we see all the time. We have a little bit of factoids here, a factoid there, and it's all placed together to form a story, no matter how insidious and ridiculous it is. And that's what the state goes with, right? And so, I mean, remember, all the defense could do is bring witness after witness, right? To say, hey, Stephen was actually with me doing such and such, and there were timestamps, there were receipts, but the state came up with this ridiculous scenario where Stephen apparently had the time to leave his 5 children, his wife, and go down to the beach, commit a sexual assault, and then go back shopping again. And you're thinking, wait, and yet, Big Jeff, that's exactly what happened. And this man got placed in prison for a total, The sentence was for 32 years, and I believe he got out. He was exonerated after 18 years. And of course, who exonerated Stephen? Our good friend Cherie Cohen. Again, using hair analysis, but this time doing genomic DNA analysis, right? Note the difference? Not looking at hair, but actually looking at DNA. And what was discovered was that there was one pubic hair that was obtained from Penny. That was a combing that was done in 1985. The technology wasn't there quite yet. Now remember, the irony was I was isolating molecular markers back in 1985 during my PhD. Years down the track, Cherie Cohen was also using molecular markers to prove that the pubic hair did not belong to Stephen. But guess who? Gregory Allen, who should have always been a suspect from the get-go. And we know how that all turned out, right? It was a disaster.
It was indeed a disaster, and I think it's also worth it to point out, which, as we all know, that the way that this went down was that the Wisconsin Innocence Project actually got a hold and did some tests and said, hey, this is not Stephen Avery. They handed the results back to the Wisconsin Crime Lab. And did they promptly do that DNA test so that he could walk out the door the next day? Is that how that went down?
Well, the disaster, well, there's twofold, actually. First of all, we know that Colburn received a phone call in which Gregory Allen had actually confessed and said that, look, you've got someone in prison who didn't commit this crime. Well, we know how good Colburn is at transmitting information, right? It basically got buried for 10 years. So Stephen Avery sat in prison for, I think it was 8 to 10 years, unnecessarily. And then to make matters worse, once they discovered the pubic hair, there was just one. One pubic hair had a hair root where you can obtain DNA from. Cherie Cohen took a year to analyze the results. And normally we're talking about maybe a 2 to 4 hour turnaround. So poor Stephen sat in prison for an extra year because Cherie Cohen sat on the information. She didn't do, maybe she did the PCR and didn't want to let anyone know until a year later. And of course, we know how that turned out, Big Jeff. Stephen Avery got released. He got exonerated for that.
That's just despicable behavior by a state entity that, a citizen could sit in prison for an extra year because she can't get off her butt and do that test.
Correct.
That's just despicable.
Yes, it is.
As we sort of make the transition from the 1985 case to the 2005 murder, it might be a good time to listen to that clip that you and I have had so much fun over in previous videos.
Oh, yes.
Deputy Sheriff Jean Couchet weighing in on the importance of DNA evidence. Are you ready for this clip?
Of course.
Okay, so has DNA evidence been fabricated before? Yes.
You think that happened here?
I don't know.
So what do you make of that clip, Dr. Silkman?
Well, it really is interesting, Gene's comment for a start. And he's the one that, of course, drew the drawing that got Stephen into big trouble in the first place. And he believed that his drawing was actually more powerful than DNA evidence itself. But he did let something slip. And he was asked about whether DNA could be manipulated or fabricated. And he said, of course. And he was asked, well, was it manipulated in this case? And he puts his hands out, I don't know. And, the disturbing thing, Big Jeff, is that despite the exoneration, with hard physical evidence, the DNA, he still believed in the guilt of Stephen. But what is interesting is he never explained how a pubic hair of Gregory Allen, who was a known sex offender, ended up on Penny Bernstein. You know, where do these guys come up with all this stuff? And yet that was the attitude of some of the officers in the MTSO. And I think we all know how that played out in the Teresa Hallbar case. Yeah, very devastating.
What strikes me about that clip is that when he's asked, can DNA evidence be fake? I don't even think he takes a breath before he says yes. I mean, he says it. If yes, I mean, what is the time in between being asked that question and him answering it?
Yeah.
And even more remarkable, what doesn't he say? He said, well, you know, in order to fake that evidence, you'd have to somehow overcome our evidence storage procedures, which are beyond question, and you'd have to somehow, or you'd have to somehow involve our DNA analysts who are impeachable beyond reproach.
Yes.
He doesn't say any of that. He says yes.
No, that's correct. And I think that was a Freudian slip. Because remember, in this case, we have one central person, Cherie Cohane. And as I said to you, she's the head of the DNA unit, which means that she does all the majority of the swabbing, the majority of the PCR, the majority of putting all the results together. So therefore, if she has nefarious intentions, a Big Jeff, it's not a big stretch of the imagination of what can be done. Results can be manipulated, swabs can be manipulated, anything can. You don't, I argue this with guilters, you do not need a vast conspiracy involving hundreds of people. All you need is one or two that cooperate with each other, and that's it. Now remember, the reason why all this went down, and I'm sure the listeners are well aware, was that Peg wrote this big report regarding what the police did, what law enforcement did to put Stephen in prison incorrectly. And the report, as you know, stated that, hey, nobody did a thing wrong. So therefore, we can put a person away potentially for 32 years, and no one's got any responsibility, no one's got any blame whatsoever. Well, the civil lawsuit lawyers and Stephen had had enough. So they came up with a civil lawsuit of up to $36 million. This was serious. Now think about this. You've got Cherie Cohane, who puts him in prison the first time. You've got Cherie Cohane, who takes him out of prison with the DNA forensic evidence. Now, as a result of his exoneration, you now have Stephen, who comes up with a civil lawsuit. So potentially, can you see the conflict here? Cherie Cohane releases him. He has a civil lawsuit, and you now have the MTSO going, uh-oh, one of our own laboratory techs has got him out, and as a consequence of him being released, he's now got a lawsuit. And that civil lawsuit potentially could have affected hundreds of people in the county.
Most definitely.
Would have been a disaster, Big Jeff.
It would have been a disaster, I think, from multiple dimensions, not only the financial dimension. I'd encourage listeners who want to learn more to take a listen on the Foul Play channel to the reading of the document. You can find Peg's document, and even though she did absolve the state of any wrongdoing, in other words, there was no criminal behavior that anyone should be charged for, she pretty well outlined the case against Gregory Allen and went into some of the things that Gregory Allen did in great detail. And it is very important to understand that, and even alluded to some of the potential shenanigans of Sheriff Kasurik and D.A. Vogel with regard to saying things like Vogel, for example, saying that he had checked with Gregory Allen's parole officer on the day of Penny Bernstein's rape, that Gregory Allen was in a different county than Penny Bernstein was raped in. But it turns out that, oh, by the way, Gregory Allen hadn't yet been arrested yet. But there's no way he could have checked with that. That parole officer was non-existent at the time. So there's a lot of potential shenanigans there as well. And not only could have you potentially had a tremendous financial disaster on your hands, but you also could have uncovered a bunch of the corruption and the old boy network is quaking in their boots.
That's it. That is correct. It's listeners have got to understand it's just not a case of, look, handing over 36 million. And I don't think Stephen would have got 36 million. He probably would have walked away with 2 or 3. And he would have been happy with that, because he even said, hey, this is not about the money. And it basically was so that the county, the law enforcement officers of the county were accountable. You just can't go around being cowboys and doing whatever you wanted, which is the attitude that a lot of these guys had, and openly. They did this openly. The big problem, Big Jeff, as we know, is that every criminal who had forensics done by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab would have put up their hand and said, wait a minute, I don't trust the forensics. I want a new trial. I want someone else to go over all my evidence again, because I believe I'm innocent and I've been set up too. So, Big Jeff, we know it would have been a massive domino effect, which could have ended up costing the county hundreds of millions of dollars. That's
I believe that those dominoes, as they begin to fall, they fall in the direction of Quantico, Virginia, too, where the FBI Engineering Research Facility is, because it's the FBI that's the one that is validating that the methods that are being used to put people in prison are actually viable scientific methods. And all of a sudden, if something like hair analysis is ruled not scientifically viable anymore, then who's in trouble? Every person, not only every person who has had their evidence tested in Manitowoc, but every person who's ever had a hair conviction on as any part of the evidence that convicted them is going to be warranted a new trial, right?
Yes, and we're always hearing cases of exoneration due to bad forensics, and unfortunately that even occurs in my country, Big Jeff. We've had many big cases due to bad forensics, due to bias. People have been sent to prison only years later for someone else to come along and say, hey, this is all junk science. And I believe that's precisely the way Kathleen Zellner will approach this case, to disprove the forensics, to disprove the state's case. And I believe, it's all there, all the work is there. She just needs her day in court, Big Jeff, for sure.
So we've diverted a little bit from our intent of if we could go back to that. Really, perhaps it's in the spirit of telling people what problem we're trying to solve. The question that I would pose is we are going to expose some shenanigans having to do with the evidence in violation of laboratory procedure. Was this done on purpose or by accident? Right? Is Sherry a stooge of the state, or is this all viable procedure that she engaged in? And that's the question I'd like to pose to you right now as we step back towards item FL and the procedures. If you could talk about that procedure just a little bit of what the procedures are and why are they the way they are.
Well, let me just backtrack a little bit. Cherie Cohane inserted herself in this case. Basically, what she did was all the DNA swabs from the Toyota RAV4 that allegedly belonged to Teresa Horbach, the victim, and she did all the DNA swabs that belonged to Stephen Avery in his vehicle. So she decided she was going to take the lead role in doing all the DNA swabs and the PCR reactions. Now, the first sign of nefarious activity, and I have to mention this, was when Tom Fassbender phoned up Cherie Cohane. Now, remember, they're meant to be independent people. Tom Fassbender, he was the special agent and he was an investigator in the Teresa Halbach case. Well, he phoned up Cherie Cohen on the 11th of November, the 11th, so very early on during the case, the investigation. And Cherie Cohen, believe it or not, wrote down what Tom Fassbender asked her to do, and I quote, try to put her, referring obviously to Teresa, in his house or garage. Now, let me just tell you how serious that is. You have got the lead investigator phoning the head of the DNA unit who's meant to be doing independent forensic testing, and the special agent tells Cherie Cohen to somehow manipulate the results or forensic data to try and put her, Teresa Halbach, in his house or garage. Now, the listeners should be outraged and should be shocked, including guilters, because that casts a shadow of doubt over the entire investigation. You don't know what Cherie Cohen actually did, even with a full set of instructions. You don't know whether she manipulated results to place her in his, Stephen's, house or garage. Big Jeff, I mean, surely that straight away, before we even get into what went wrong, to me, that puts a cloud of doubt on the entire case right there.
Oh, it certainly does, and it's unfortunate in the United States of America that the state crime labs are overseen by the FBI, and it is not independent at all. I believe that the people at the state crime lab would tell you they are employees for the Justice Department and not independent evaluators. They're not underwriters' laboratories in any way, looking for unbiased results. These are not blind tests that are done.
Excellent point.
That's the way it ought to be, but it's not the way it is.
Yeah, so here's the issue. Now, if you're doing science, right, you want to make sure that you do proper controls and you do blind testing. Here's the problem. We have Cherie Cohen who did all the swabbing. So she knew beforehand where the samples had come from. You then have Special Investigator Fassbender telling Cherie Cohen, try to put her in his house or garage, which means that you now lack true independence. You've now got an element of bias. Now, I can't believe the judge didn't say to the state, guys, we're throwing out this case right now. I don't trust any of the results. In other words, I want an independent tester to retest everything. And in actual fact, Big Jeff, that's the proper way to do it. You need an independent tester who doesn't know what they are testing. Whereas Cherie Cohen knew. She knew what the samples were.
I think it's even worse than you're saying, because I don't believe that the state crime lab gets paid unless they come up with a quote-unquote positive result for the state.
Yes, I have heard that as well. So the pressure is right on Cherie Cohen. As you can see, she's got a lot of samples to process, a lot of results to obtain, and she's getting this pressure from Tom Fassbender, and Lord knows who else was whispering in her ear. Now, Big Jeff, do you want me to talk about item FL?
Oh, I think it's essential that we get to item FL. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, this is the way it went down. And again, I've done a presentation on item FL for the listeners who want an in-depth discussion. Essentially, this is the way it panned out. No one knew about item FL. No one. The investigators went into Stephen Avery's trailer garage on multiple occasions. No one found any bullets. No one found any traces of Teresa Halbach, either inside the trailer or inside the garage. There was nothing. Well, unfortunately, Brendan Dassey, who's the nephew of Stephen, inserted himself into the case. And he underwent, I think, 6 interrogations by Fassbender and Wiegert. And you can see, I think it was March the 1st, the interrogation session on March the 1st, Wiegert and Fassbender were completely bombarding Brendan. And they were asking him, okay, what happened to the head? What happened to the head? And you can see that Brendan had no idea what they were talking about. And he said all sorts of things. Except Wiegert became so frustrated, he came out and said, who shot her in the head? Right? So he gave away a very important piece of information to Brendan. Well, Brendan obviously didn't do it. He said, Stephen. Now remember this. Fassbender and Wiegert convinced Brendan that they knew what had happened. We know what has happened. We just want you to tell us. So Stephen must have somehow shot her. And according to Brendan, they shot the victim, Teresa Hobart, 10 or 11 times, and Brendan couldn't remember it. Because I asked him, well, how come you didn't tell us? And he said, because I couldn't think of it. Now, how outrageous is that, Big Jeff?
It's just remarkable. It is absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that Brendan inserted himself into this as much as he was dragged in kicking and screaming.
He was. Yes, he was. Yes, he was, Big Jeff. This is the tragedy. He walked into the bear trap. He trusted people, and they took him to pieces. Anyway.
Yeah. As you pointed out in your presentation, it was really, I think, the November 6th interview that where his defining moment, really, where they found that he was easily manipulated into saying just about anything that they wanted.
Yes. Well, anyway, now let's backtrack a little bit. The state knew they found 2 pieces of cranial bone, burnt cranial bone fragments. Those cranial bone fragments had beveling, indication that a high velocity bullet went through the skull. They were able to reconstruct part of the skull and determine where those cranial bone fragments were. One was on the left side of the temple and the other one was behind the head. So the victim was shot twice. In fact, it was very reminiscent of a drug hit execution style. One in the back of the head and one on the left temple. Right? Well, according to Brendan, they shot her 10 or 11 times. The problem with that, Big Jeff, is there's no blood anywhere. There's no blood. There's no blood micro spray anywhere. On the rifle, on the items in the garage, nothing. Right? However, what happened? On March the 2nd, they get another search warrant. This is months after the initial investigation. And Big Jeff, the investigators go in the garage. They completely empty out the garage. Lo and behold, what do they find on the floor? 2 bullet fragments. Right?
If we could take a step back, even further than that, if we could sort of summarize the timeline for the listeners, we are jumping around a little bit. Teresa disappears October 31st.
Correct.
The RAV Force found November 5th.
Yes.
Stephen is arrested November 9th.
Yes.
All this testing is done. They don't have a single thing that puts Teresa and Stephen together in his house or the garage.
Or the garage. Correct.
Or the garage. And lo and behold, in comes Brendan. They were working on Jody, Stephen's fiance. When she doesn't cooperate, they pull in Brendan.
Correct.
Brendan says, "Oh, we shot her in the head." They ask, "Oh, there must have been giant pools of blood on the garage floor, right?"
Yes.
And so before they find the bullet, they go into the garage and they jackhammer the cement in the garage because of the large pools of blood that Brendan talks about, because the garage floor is made of slabs. There's a big seam in between. And there's a seam. There's literally a seam in the cement because it's two different slabs, right? That's separated by about 1/4 of an inch. That blood must have seeped down in there. Well, that would have been impossible to clean and get everything out.
Absolutely.
And the fact that it's porous. So they jackhammer it. Do they find a single piece of blood in the entire cement that they jackhammer?
No, none whatsoever. None. And you see, this is the classic case of either Brendan and Stephen are forensic gurus, or they're the dumbest criminals on the planet. And the state is trying to say that they are both, forensic gurus and complete dumbasses. Apologies for swearing. And you can't. If you're that good in cleaning DNA microspray, blood microspray from when you were shot, and people have done high-speed photography, they know what happens when a bullet penetrates skull. Remember, the brain, you've got blood, it squirts everywhere, and especially microdroplets. And they've got chemical sprays, luminol. They could tell where the blood has gone, right? Where it's gone. On the gun, on items around the garage. They turned the whole place upside down. They found nothing. And the simplest answer is not because they didn't find nothing. It's because a shooting event never took place. You see, the state never went to the obvious logical conclusion. Right, Big Jeff? They came up with every excuse under the sun. And I remember Uyghur, the final word he said was, he was asked, well, did you find any traces of this person? Did you find any traces of that person? And he said, no, they had 5 days to clean up. Just like that. So in other words, when all the forensics came back, and believe me, Big Jeff, they swabbed everything everywhere. Shariko Hain had hundreds of samples to deal with, right? And she was asked, did you find any evidence of Brendan Dassey anywhere? No. I had his DNA profile, but I couldn't find any evidence of him. Did you find any evidence of Teresa Horbach either in the garage or in the trailer? Nope, nothing whatsoever. Bedding, they turned the whole place upside down, as you know, Big Jeff. But here's the thing, here's the kicker. The state said, well, the boys used bleach. Well, guess what? They found Stephen's DNA on the cuffs, which proved that he couldn't have used cuffs to cuff Teresa, like Brendan said, because Stephen's DNA was there, right? So he couldn't have selectively cleaned Teresa Horbach's DNA. And in the garage on the floor, they found Stephen's DNA and nobody else. So therefore, the theory that they cleaned up is rubbish.
It's rubbish.
It is absolute rubbish.
Another interesting thing, circumstance, right, is they find themselves at a dearth of evidence. The state knows that Avery is pursuing a planting defense. The key looks very fishy.
Yes, it does.
The blood in the rab. We had the incident at the thing, and in the evidence room, they get Brendan to confess. Very interestingly, you can watch Henbury's videos of the search. That he's released. There's 6 inches of snow on the ground.
Correct.
So the only place you can't do any outside searching, but very conveniently for the state, they managed to find item FL as you in the garage shortly after doing the jackhammering of the concrete.
Yes.
Less any concrete dust on the top of it, but we'll let that go for a second. All right. Well, very good. I think we're sensitive to the time. I really appreciate your time. I know it's extremely valuable.
Pleasure.
The boys are very lucky to have you on the case. Well, thanks everybody for listening. And with that, this has been a Foul Play production.